Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest miracles. What would you do if you saw someone struggling to pay for something as simple as bus fare? Most people would look away, mind their own business, or make excuses about being in a hurry. But what if that one moment of choice between helping or ignoring could completely transform not just one life, but two? This is the remarkable true story of Keisha Williams, a young woman who grew up in the hardest neighborhoods of Detroit, where every dollar counted and trust was a luxury few could afford. She learned early that the world wasn't fair, that opportunities were scarce, and that sometimes you had to choose between eating dinner or buying school supplies. Yet somehow, through all the struggles and disappointments, she never lost her belief that people deserved kindness, even when life had given her every reason to become bitter and selfish. On one ordinary Tuesday morning, Keisha would board a city bus with exactly enough money for her own fare and lunch. She had no idea that within the next few minutes, her decision to help a stranger would set in motion a series of events that would challenge everything she thought she knew about wealth, poverty, and the invisible threads that connect us all. She couldn't have imagined that the ragged man fumbling for change in his torn pockets was about to become the most important person she'd ever meet. What happens when genuine kindness meets hidden wealth? When someone who has nothing gives everything they can to someone who secretly is everything? This is more than just a story about money or success. It's about the moment when two completely different worlds collide on public transportation, and how one young woman's pure heart would unlock doors she never even knew existed. Get ready for a journey that will make you question what real wealth truly means, and why sometimes the most powerful people in the world are hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to see their humanity instead of their appearance. The alarm clock's harsh buzzing cut through the thin walls of the cramped apartment at exactly 5:30 a.m. Keisha Williams rolled over on the worn mattress, her body aching from another night of restless sleep on springs that had given up years ago. The Detroit winter had been particularly brutal this year, and despite the ancient radiator's constant clanking, the cold seemed to seep through every crack and crevice of their third-floor unit. She lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds that marked the beginning of each day in the Brewster projects. The couple next door was already arguing about bills, their voices carrying through the paper-thin walls. Somewhere below, Mrs. Peterson's baby was crying, a sound that had become as regular as clockwork. The distant rumble of the city buses starting their morning routes mixed with the occasional siren, creating the urban symphony that had been Keisha's lullaby for all 22 years of her life. Keisha pushed herself up from the mattress, her bare feet hitting the cold linoleum floor. The apartment was quiet now. Her mother had already left for her job at the hospital laundry, starting her shift before dawn to catch the first bus. Her younger brother Marcus was still asleep on the couch in the living room, wrapped in the same blanket their grandmother had crocheted years before she passed away. At 15, Marcus was growing fast, his long legs hanging off the end of the second-hand sofa that served as his bed. The kitchen was barely big enough for one person, but Keisha moved through it with practiced efficiency. She opened the refrigerator, knowing exactly what she would find: a half-gallon of milk with 2 days left before expiration, some leftover rice from dinner, and a few slices of bologna that would become Marcus's lunch. She had learned long ago to mentally calculate every meal, every expense, every decision through the lens of their family's perpetual financial tightrope. After a quick shower in the bathroom they shared with the neighbors when the pipes weren't frozen, Keisha dressed in her work uniform. Black pants from the thrift store, a white button-down shirt that she had ironed the night before, and the comfortable but worn shoes that had carried her through 2 years of double shifts at Morrison's family diner. She pinned her natural hair back neatly and applied just enough makeup to look professional, using products she had made last for months by being extremely careful with every application. Before leaving, she stopped by the couch where Marcus was stirring awake. She gently shook his shoulder and pressed a $5 bill into his hand, money she had set aside from tips the previous evening. "For lunch," she whispered, knowing he would try to protest. "And, Marcus, go to school today? Please, don't make me come looking for you again." Marcus mumbled something that might have been agreement and tucked the money into his pocket. Keisha knew that at his age, the temptation to skip classes and Hang out with friends who had given up on education was strong. The streets offered immediate excitement and the illusion of quick money, while school seemed to promise only more years of struggle with no guarantee of a better future. But she also knew that education was the only ladder out of their circumstances, even if it felt impossibly tall from where they stood at the bottom. The morning air hit her face like a sharp slap as she stepped outside the apartment building. February in Detroit was unforgiving, with a wind that seemed to find every gap in her coat and remind her that spring was still months away. She walked quickly toward the bus stop, her breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. The neighborhood was slowly coming to life around her. Corner stores rolling up their security gates, early commuters trudging toward their own bus stops, and the ever-present sound of cars struggling to start in the cold. Keisha had exactly $4.50 in her purse, $2.50 for the bus fare, and $2 for lunch, probably a small soup from the diner's kitchen that would have to sustain her through an 8-hour shift. This was the mathematics of poverty that she had mastered. Every penny accounted for, every purchase weighed against basic survival needs. There was no room for impulse, no buffer for emergencies, and certainly no money for the small luxuries that other people took for granted. The bus stop was crowded with the usual collection of early morning commuters, women in scrubs heading to hospital shifts, men in work boots carrying lunch pails, students clutching bus passes and backpacks. Keisha recognized many of the faces from her daily routine, though they rarely spoke to each other. In the projects, you learn to mind your own business, to avoid eye contact that might be misinterpreted, and to move through public spaces with quiet efficiency. When the number 16 bus rounded the corner, belching black exhaust into the gray morning sky, Keisha felt the familiar mix of relief and resignation. Relief that the bus was running on time. Resignation that this ride would take her to another day of serving coffee and cleaning tables for customers who barely acknowledged her existence. She had been working at Morrison's since graduating high school, saving every penny she could while helping her mother pay rent and keep Marcus fed and in school. The bus doors opened with a hydraulic hiss, and passengers began boarding in the slow, orderly fashion of people who had performed this ritual countless times before. Keisha climbed the steps, feeling the warmth of the heated interior wash over her cold skin. The bus driver, a heavy-set black man named Harold whom she had been seeing on this route for over a year, nodded at her with professional courtesy. She had her fare ready, as always, fishing the exact change from her purse without looking. That's when she noticed the commotion near the front of the bus. An elderly white man was standing beside the fare box, patting his pockets with increasing desperation. His clothes were immediately noticeable, a coat that had seen better days, with visible tears along the seams, and stains that suggested it hadn't been cleaned in some time. His pants were too big for his thin frame, held up by a belt that was tightened to the last hole. His shoes were worn down at the heels, and his gray hair was uncombed and slightly greasy, sticking up at odd angles as if he had slept in an uncomfortable position. "I'm sorry," the man was saying to Harold, his voice shaking slightly. "I thought I had the exact change. I could have sworn I put it in my pocket this morning." He continued searching through his coat pockets, pulling out lint, a few crumpled receipts, and what looked like a broken pair of reading glasses, but no money. The other passengers were beginning to show signs of impatience. Behind Keisha, someone muttered under their breath about delays. A woman near the back of the bus loudly tapped her watch and sighed. The universal urban irritation with anything that disrupted the morning commute was beginning to build like pressure in a kettle. Harold, to his credit, was trying to be patient. "Look, sir, I understand, but I can't let you ride without paying the fare. It's not personal, it's just the rules. Maybe you could call someone to come pick you up." The man's face reddened slightly, whether from embarrassment or cold. Keisha couldn't tell. I don't have anyone to call," he said quietly. "I really thought I had the money. I'm sorry to hold everyone up." From her position in line, Keisha could see the man's hands more clearly now. Despite his disheveled appearance, his hands were clean, with neat fingernails that suggested he hadn't been living on the streets for very long. There was something about his posture, too, that seemed at odds with his appearance. Even in his obvious distress, he stood straight, with the bearing of someone who was accustomed to being treated with respect. The math in Keisha's head was simple and immediate. Her bus fare was $2.50. The man needed $2.50. If she gave him her fare money, she would have to walk to work, which would make her at least 30 minutes late, and might cost her the job she desperately needed. If she kept her money and said nothing, the man would be asked to leave the bus, and she would arrive at work on time, ready to start another day of earning the small wages that kept her family afloat. But there was another calculation happening in Keisha's mind, one that had nothing to do with dollars and cents. She thought about all the times her own family had been in situations where a small kindness from a stranger could have made the difference between dignity and humiliation. She remembered being 8 years old and watching her mother count and recount the money in her purse at the grocery store, trying to figure out what items they would have to put back. She remembered the shame of having her school lunch application denied because of a paperwork error and spending 3 days with nothing but the free breakfast the school provided. The silence on the bus was growing uncomfortable. Harold was looking at his watch, clearly torn between company policy and human compassion. The man continued to search his pockets, even though it was obvious he had already checked them thoroughly. The other passengers were shifting restlessly, their morning routines disrupted by this unexpected drama. "Sir," Harold said gently, "I'm really sorry, but I'm going to have to ask you to step off the bus. Maybe the next driver will be able to work something out, but I just can't break the rules." The man nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I understand," he said. "I'm sorry for the trouble." He turned toward the exit, moving with the careful dignity of someone trying to preserve their self-respect in a humiliating situation. That's when Keisha stepped forward. "Wait," she said, loud enough for Harold to hear. Every eye on the bus turned toward her. She could feel the weight of their attention, some curious, some impatient, some simply waiting to see what would happen next. "I'll cover his fare." She moved toward the fare box, pulling out $5 from her purse, the money she had planned to use for her own transportation and lunch. "This should cover both of us," she said to Harold, feeding the bills into the machine. The man turned to look at her, his eyes wide with surprise and something that might have been gratitude. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a clear blue, intelligent and alert despite his disheveled appearance. "Young lady," he said, "I can't let you do that. You don't even know me." "It's just bus fare," Keisha replied, though they both knew it was much more than that. Everyone deserves to get where they're going. Harold processed the payment and gestured for both of them to find seats. The other passengers settled back into their morning routines, the crisis resolved. Some looked at Keisha with approval, others with the blank indifference of people who had seen stranger things on public transportation. The bus lurched forward, continuing its route through the city. Keisha found an empty seat near the middle of the bus and settled in for the 45-minute ride to the restaurant. She tried not to think about the fact that she would now have to walk home after her shift, or that she would be working an 8-hour day with no lunch break. Instead, she found herself thinking about the man she had just helped, wondering what circumstances had brought him to that moment of desperation on a city bus. The man had taken a seat near the front, but she could see him occasionally glancing back in her direction. There was something about his bearing, even in his obvious poverty, that suggested he wasn't accustomed to accepting charity. The way he sat, the way he held his head, the careful politeness with which he had spoken to Harold, all suggested someone who had fallen from better circumstances rather than someone who had never known them. As the bus made its way through the city, stopping to pick up more passengers at each designated stop, Keisha found herself wondering about the stories of the people around her. The woman in scrubs clutching a coffee cup might be a single mother working double shifts to support her children. The teenager with his head buried in a textbook might be the first in his family to attend college. The construction worker checking his phone might be calculating whether his paycheck would stretch to cover his child's birthday present. Everyone on this bus was going somewhere, trying to build something. 20 minutes into the bus ride, something unexpected happened. The elderly man who had been sitting near the front stood up carefully, using the seat backs to steady himself, and made his way down the aisle toward where Keisha was sitting. She looked up from the window where she had been watching the city wake up, surprised to see him approaching her seat. "Miss," he said softly, "would you mind if I sat with you for a moment? I wanted to properly thank you for what you did back there." Keisha gestured to the empty seat beside her, though she felt a slight nervous flutter in her stomach. Growing up in the projects had taught her to be cautious about strangers, especially ones whose circumstances seemed unclear. But something about this man's polite demeanor and the genuine gratitude in his voice made her feel that he was harmless. He settled into the seat with a slight grunt, clearly favoring his left leg as if it pained him. Up close, she could see more details that didn't quite fit with his ragged appearance. His teeth, when he smiled, were straight and white, suggesting good dental care at some point in his life. His hands, though weathered, didn't have the deep ingrained dirt she would have expected from someone living rough. And there was something about the way he spoke, a certain formality that suggested education and refinement. "My name is William," he said, extending his hand for a handshake. His grip was firm and confident, another small detail that seemed at odds with his circumstances. "William Hayes. And you are?" "Keisha Williams," she replied, accepting the handshake. "And you really don't need to thank me. Anyone would have done the same thing." William shook his head slowly, a sad smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I'm afraid that's not true, Miss Williams. I've been in situations lately where I've learned that kindness is far rarer than it should be. What you did back there, when you didn't know me from Adam, when you clearly don't have money to spare yourself, that was something special." Keisha felt herself blushing slightly. She had never been comfortable with praise or attention, and this man's formal way of speaking was making her feel self-conscious. "How do you know I don't have money to spare?" she asked, though not defensively. William's eyes took in her carefully maintained, but obviously inexpensive clothes, the way she had counted exact change, the worn but clean appearance that spoke of someone who took pride in their appearance despite limited resources. "I recognize the signs," he said gently. "I've learned to see them in myself recently." There was something in his tone that suggested a story, and Keisha found herself curious despite her usual caution. "Recently?" she asked. William was quiet for a moment, looking out the bus window at the passing neighborhoods. They were moving through the industrial section of the city now, past factories and warehouses that had seen better days, some boarded up with broken windows, others still functioning but showing their age. "I haven't always looked like this," he said finally. 6 months ago, I was wearing $1,000 suits and making decisions that affected hundreds of people's jobs. Funny how quickly things can change." Keisha studied his profile as he spoke. Now that he mentioned it, she could see it. Despite the worn clothes and unkempt appearance, there was something about his bearing that suggested he was telling the truth. The way he held his head, the careful pronunciation of his words, even the way he sat suggested someone who was accustomed to command and respect. "What happened?" she asked, then immediately felt intrusive for prying. "I'm sorry, that's none of my business." "It's all right," William said, turning back to her. "It's not a secret, unfortunately. It was in all the papers, though I suspect not many people in this part of the city read the business section. My company was involved in a scandal. Financial irregularities that I knew nothing about. But, as the CEO, I was held responsible. Lost everything overnight. House, cars, reputation, most of my friends. Turns out loyalty is a luxury that disappears pretty quickly when the money does." Keisha listened in fascination. She had never met anyone who had lost so much so quickly. In her experience, poverty was a generational condition, something you were born into and struggled to escape from. The idea of falling from wealth to destitution was almost incomprehensible to her. "Where are you staying now?" she asked. William's expression grew uncomfortable. "Here and there. I had some savings that weren't tied up in the company assets, but legal fees ate through most of that pretty quickly. Been staying in shelters mostly, though they're not always safe for someone my age. Last night I slept in the bus station, which is why I look so." He gestured at his disheveled appearance. "And your family? Don't you have anyone who could help?" William's laugh was bitter. "My ex-wife made sure to divorce me the moment the scandal broke. Took half of what little remained after the lawyers got through with it. My children, well, they're adults with their own lives. They believed the stories in the papers, figured their old man was just another greedy executive who finally got caught. Can't say I blame them, really. The evidence looked pretty convincing, even to me for a while." Keisha found herself feeling a deep sympathy for this man. She had never had wealth to lose, but She understood the pain of being abandoned by people you thought you could count on. "Do you have somewhere to go today?" she asked. "I have a job interview," Williams said, straightening his shoulders with obvious pride. "Nothing fancy, just a clerk position at a shipping company downtown. The pay isn't much, but it's honest work, and if I can get it, I might be able to afford a small apartment eventually." "Is that where you're heading now?" "Yes, though I'm not sure how I'm going to explain my appearance. I tried to clean up as much as I could in the bus station restroom, but there's only so much you can do without proper facilities." He looked down at his clothes with obvious embarrassment. "I know I don't look like much of a candidate for anything right now." Keisha felt a surge of emotion that surprised her. Here was a man who had lost everything, who was clearly struggling with the basics of survival, and yet he was still trying to rebuild his life with dignity. It reminded her of her mother, who had worked multiple jobs and never complained, even when they were at their lowest points financially. "What kind of work did you do before?" she asked. "I was the CEO of Hayes Construction Company. We specialized in affordable housing developments, trying to build quality homes for working families." "Ironic, isn't it? I spent my career trying to help people find good places to live, and now I can't afford one myself." The name Hayes Construction sounded vaguely familiar to Keisha, though she couldn't place where she might have heard it. "What was the scandal about?" William's expression darkened. "Someone in my finance department was skimming money from construction budgets and doctoring the books to cover it up. When the state auditors came in for a routine inspection, they found millions of dollars unaccounted for. Since I was the CEO, I was held responsible for oversight failures, even though I had no knowledge of what was happening." "But surely they could prove you didn't know?" "That's not how it works in business, Miss Williams. When you're in charge, everything that happens under your watch becomes your responsibility, whether you knew about it or not. The company went bankrupt, hundreds of people lost their jobs, and several housing projects that were halfway completed had to be abandoned. Families who had put down deposits on new homes lost their savings." Keisha could hear the genuine pain in his voice when he talked about the families who had been hurt. This wasn't the tone of someone who was making excuses or trying to hide guilt. This was someone who was genuinely anguished by the consequences of events beyond his control. "Did they ever catch the person who was actually stealing the money?" "Oh yes," William said with a harsh laugh. "My own nephew, it turned out. My sister's boy, someone I had trusted completely. He disappeared the day before the audit results came out, took what money he could access, and vanished. We found out later he had been living way beyond his means for years, gambling debts mostly. He used his position in the company to cover his losses. Where is he now? No one knows. The FBI has a warrant out for him, but he seems to have disappeared completely. Meanwhile, I'm the one whose face was on the front page of the business section as the disgraced CEO who lost people's life savings." Keisha was quiet for a moment, processing this story. She thought about all the times she had seen news reports about corporate scandals and automatically assumed that everyone involved was guilty, that they all deserved whatever punishment they received. It had never occurred to her that someone could be genuinely innocent and yet still lose everything. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "That's incredibly unfair." "Life often is," William replied philosophically. "I've learned that lesson rather thoroughly these past 6 months. But I've also learned things about myself that I never knew before, like how much strength you can find when you think you have none left, and how much the kindness of strangers can mean when you have nothing else to rely on." He turned to look at her directly. "Which brings me back to thanking you properly for what you did. That wasn't just bus fare you gave me, Miss Williams. That was dignity. That was the knowledge that there are still good people in the world who will help someone in need without expecting anything in return. I told you, anyone would have done the same thing." "No," William said firmly. "They wouldn't have. I've been riding buses and staying in shelters for months now, and I've seen people ignore suffering that was much more obvious than mine. You made a choice to help when you could have just as easily looked the other way. That says something important about who you are as a person." Keisha felt uncomfortable with the praise, but also touched by the sincerity in his voice. She had been raised to help when she could, but she had never thought of it as anything special. It was just what you did when you saw someone in trouble. "What's your job interview for exactly?" she asked, changing the subject. "Warehouse clerk at Morrison Shipping. Filing, inventory tracking, basic computer work. Not exactly what I spent my career training for, But I'm not in a position to be picky. The man I spoke with on the phone seemed willing to give me a chance despite my circumstances. Morrison Shipping, Keisha repeated, the name sparking a memory. I think they deliver supplies to the restaurant where I work. Morrison's Family Diner. Maybe they're connected somehow. Could be, Williams said. It's not a large company, from what I understand. Family-owned business that's been around for generations. They rode in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the city pass by outside the windows. The bus was making good time despite the morning traffic, and Keisha realized they would be reaching her stop soon. She found herself reluctant to end this conversation, curious to know how Williams' interview would go, whether he would be able to get back on his feet. Can I ask you something? Williams said suddenly. Sure. What made you decide to help me? Really? You said anyone would have done it. But we both know that's not true. What was it about that moment that made you step forward? Keisha thought about the question seriously. I guess I've been in situations where a little help would have made a big difference, she said slowly. And I know what it feels like to have people look at you and make assumptions about who you are based on how you look or where you come from. I saw you standing there, and you looked like someone who was trying to maintain his dignity in a really difficult situation. I respect that. William nodded thoughtfully. And what about you? What's your story? What has your life been like? Not very interesting, Keisha said with a self-deprecating laugh. Born and raised in the projects, graduated high school, working at a diner while I try to figure out what comes next. Pretty standard stuff around here. Do you have dreams? Things you want to accomplish? The question caught Keisha off guard. Most people in her life were too focused on immediate survival to talk about dreams. I guess I'd like to go to college someday, she said hesitantly. Maybe study business or education. I want to do something that matters, you know? Something that helps people improve their lives. That's not standard at all, Williams said with conviction. That's admirable. What's stopping you from pursuing college now? Money mainly. And time. I work full-time to help support my family, so I can't really afford to be a full-time student. I've looked into community college, but even that is expensive when you're already stretched thin. Have you looked into financial aid? Scholarships? Some. But there's a lot of paperwork, and I'm not sure I qualify for much. My grades were good in high school, but not spectacular. And there are a lot of people competing for the same opportunities. William was quiet for a moment, seeming to think deeply about something. Miss Williams, he said finally, I want you to know that this conversation has meant more to me than you might realize. It's been months since someone talked to me like I was a real person rather than a problem to be solved or avoided. You've given me more than bus fare today. You've given me hope that there are still decent people in the world. Keisha felt her eyes getting slightly damp at the sincerity in his voice. I hope your interview goes well, she said. I really do. So do I, Williams said, then reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn business card. This probably doesn't mean much anymore, but I'd like you to have it. If you ever need anything, if there's ever any way I can return your kindness, please don't hesitate to contact me. Keisha took the card and looked at it. It was simple, and 3 weeks passed after Keisha's encounter with William on the bus, and life continued its familiar pattern of challenges and small victories. The walk home from work that first day had been brutal in the February cold, taking nearly 2 hours and leaving her feet aching and her body exhausted. But she had made it, and more importantly, she had made it to work on time despite giving away her bus fare. The diner had been particularly busy that day, filled with the usual mix of regulars who came in for coffee and conversation, construction workers grabbing quick lunches, and the occasional family celebrating a small milestone with pancakes and bacon. Keisha moved through her shift with practiced efficiency, taking orders, refilling coffee cups, and clearing tables with the automatic movements of someone who had performed these tasks thousands of times before. Her boss, Mr. Morrison, was a decent man in his 60s who had inherited the restaurant from his father and ran it with the kind of old-school values that seemed increasingly rare in the modern world. He paid his employees fairly, though not generously, and he didn't ask too many questions about their personal lives as long as they showed up on time and did their work well. When Keisha had arrived that morning looking slightly windblown from her long walk, he had simply nodded and handed her an apron without comment. The tips that day had been average, enough to cover the money she had spent on William's bus fare, though it meant another evening of rice and beans for dinner. She didn't regret her decision, but the practical consequences of her generosity were a reminder of how thin the margin for error was in her daily life. Every dollar mattered when you lived paycheck to paycheck, and every unexpected expense could throw off the careful balance she maintained between income and survival. As the days went by, Keisha found herself thinking about William more often than she had expected. She wondered whether he had gotten the job at Morrison Shipping, whether he was still sleeping in shelters, or had managed to find more stable housing. The business card he had given her remained tucked in her purse, though she couldn't imagine any circumstance where she would actually use it. What could a former CEO who was now homeless possibly do to help someone in her situation? Marcus had been having a particularly difficult stretch at school, coming home with stories about teachers who didn't care and classmates who were more interested in fast money from corner deals than in education. The temptation to drop out and try to make money immediately was becoming stronger for him, and Keisha could see the frustration building in his eyes when he looked at their cramped apartment and their mother's constant exhaustion from working double shifts. "What's the point?" he had asked her one evening while they shared a dinner of leftover soup from the diner. "I'm learning about algebra and history while kids my age are making more money in a day than Mama makes in a week. School isn't going to get us out of here." Keisha had tried to explain that education was a long-term investment, that the quick money he was seeing on the streets came with risks that could destroy his life permanently. But she understood his frustration. When you're hungry and cold and watching your family struggle, abstract concepts like building a better future felt less important than immediate solutions to immediate problems. Their mother, Sandra, was showing signs of the physical toll that years of manual labor were taking on her body. At 43, she moved like someone much older, her back aching constantly from lifting heavy laundry bags and her hands cracked from industrial detergents. She had dreams once, Keisha knew. Dreams of becoming a nurse, of owning a small house with a garden, of seeing her children graduate from college. But those dreams had been gradually worn down by the relentless pressure of keeping food on the table and rent paid. On a Thursday evening, exactly 3 weeks after her encounter with William, Keisha was walking home from work through the gathering dusk when she noticed something unusual happening at the community center. There were several cars parked outside that didn't belong to the neighborhood, including a black sedan that looked expensive even to her untrained eye. People were gathering around the entrance, talking in excited voices about something that had everyone's attention. Mrs. Johnson, an elderly woman who lived in the building next to Keisha's family, was standing on the sidewalk with a group of other residents, all of them looking toward the community center with expressions of curiosity and anticipation. "What's going on?" Keisha asked as she approached the group. "Some kind of announcement," Mrs. Johnson replied, adjusting her thick glasses. "Rich white man showed up about an hour ago with a bunch of papers and lawyers. Said he wants to talk to the whole neighborhood about some kind of opportunity. People are saying it might be about jobs." Keisha felt a flicker of interest despite her exhaustion. Jobs were always important news in their neighborhood, where unemployment ran high and most available work was either temporary or paid below living wages. "Did anyone say what kind of jobs?" "Construction work, from what I heard. Something about building new housing. Could be good for some of the men around here who know how to do that kind of work." Keisha was about to continue walking home when something made her stop. A memory tickled at the back of her mind, something about construction and housing that seemed familiar. Then, she remembered. William had told her that his company, Hayes Construction, had specialized in affordable housing developments. It was probably just a coincidence, but something made her curious enough to walk toward the community center to see what was happening. The main room was more crowded than she had seen it in years. Usually, community meetings drew maybe 20 or 30 people, mostly older residents who had time to attend, and a few young parents concerned about issues affecting their children. Tonight, the room was packed with people of all ages, everyone buzzing with conversation about whatever announcement was about to be made. At the front of the room, a small group of people in business suits was setting up some kind of presentation. Keisha found a spot near the back where she could see without being noticed, curious, but cautious about getting too involved in whatever this was about. Then, she saw him. William was standing near the front of the room, and the transformation was so complete that she almost didn't recognize him. Gone were the ragged clothes and unkempt appearance. He was wearing a well-tailored dark suit that looked like it cost more than Keisha made in several months. His hair was neatly styled, his face cleanly shaved, and he carried himself with the confidence and authority she had sensed beneath his desperate circumstances on the bus. For a moment, Keisha wondered if she was mistaken. Could this polished, obviously wealthy man really be the same person she had helped with bus fare just 3 weeks ago? But then he turned slightly, and she caught sight of his profile and those distinctive blue eyes. It was definitely William, though he looked like he belonged in a completely different world than the one where she had met him. Her mind raced with questions. Had he gotten the job at Morrison Shipping and somehow parlayed it into this dramatic change in circumstances? Had some family member decided to help him after all? Or was there something about his story that he hadn't told her? Some detail that might explain how someone could go from sleeping in bus stations to wearing expensive suits in such a short time? A man in his 50s who appeared to be some kind of community leader called for everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "We've asked you here tonight because someone has come forward with an opportunity that could mean significant positive changes for our neighborhood. I'd like you to meet Mr. William Hayes, who has a proposition he'd like to discuss with you." William stepped forward, and Keisha could see that despite his polished appearance, he seemed slightly nervous. He cleared his throat and looked out over the assembled crowd, his eyes scanning the faces in front of him. When his gaze reached the back of the room where Keisha was standing, their eyes met for just a moment. She saw recognition flash across his features, followed by what might have been surprise, and something else she couldn't quite identify. "Thank you all for coming out tonight," William began, his voice steady and professional. "I know many of you have had long days at work, and I appreciate you taking the time to hear what I have to say. My name is William Hayes, and I'm here to talk to you about jobs, housing, and the possibility of making some real improvements to this neighborhood." He paused, gathering his thoughts, and Keisha could see him looking in her direction again. "But before I get into the business details, I want to tell you something personal. 3 weeks ago, I was in a very different situation than I am tonight. I had lost everything due to circumstances beyond my control, and I was honestly not sure how I was going to survive. I was sleeping in shelters and bus stations, looking for any kind of work I could find, and feeling like I had lost not just my money and my home, but my dignity as well." The room had grown very quiet. This was not the kind of opening most people expected from a business presentation, and everyone was listening intently to see where this story was going. On a cold Tuesday morning, William continued, "I got on a city bus without enough money for the fare. I was embarrassed, desperate, and frankly not sure what I was going to do. The other passengers were getting impatient with me, and the driver was about to ask me to leave the bus when someone stepped forward and paid my fare. A young woman who clearly didn't have money to spare, who didn't know me, and who had every reason to mind her own business and let me solve my own problems." Keisha felt her heart beginning to race. She looked around the room and realized that several people were turning to see if they could identify the person William was talking about. "That act of kindness," William said, his voice growing stronger and more emotional, "changed the course of my entire life. Not just because it got me to a job interview that day, though it did that, but because it reminded me that there are still good people in the world, people who will help a stranger without expecting anything in return. It gave me back my faith in humanity at a time when I had almost lost it completely." He paused again, and this time when he looked toward the back of the room, he smiled slightly. "I've spent the last 3 weeks working to rebuild my life and my business, and I've been successful beyond what I thought was possible. But I never forgot that moment on the bus, and I never forgot the person who showed me that kindness. I promised myself that if I was ever in a position to return that favor, not just to her but to the community that produced someone with such a generous heart, I would do everything in my power to make it happen." William gestured to the people in business suits who were standing beside him. "These are representatives from Hayes Construction Company, which I founded and which I am now rebuilding. We specialize in affordable housing developments, and we're here tonight to announce a new project that will bring jobs and new homes to this neighborhood." The room erupted in excited conversation. People were turning to each other, asking questions, wondering what this might mean for their families and their futures. Keisha stood frozen in place, trying to process what she was hearing. "We're planning to build 200 new housing units in this area," William continued, raising his voice to be heard over the crowd. "These will be affordable homes designed for working families, built to the highest standards, and sold at prices that people with regular jobs can actually afford. The project will create approximately 300 construction jobs over the next 2 years, and we're committed to hiring locally whenever possible." The questions came rapidly from the crowd. How much would the homes cost? When would construction begin? What qualifications were needed for the jobs? William answered each question patiently and thoroughly, providing details about wages, job training programs, and financing options for potential homeowners. As the formal presentation continued, Keisha found herself unable to concentrate on the specific details. Her mind was reeling with the implications of what she was witnessing. The homeless man she had helped with bus fare was apparently a successful businessman who was about to transform her neighborhood. Everything about that morning on the bus suddenly looked different from this new perspective. Had he been testing her somehow? Had the whole thing been some kind of elaborate setup? But even as these thoughts crossed her mind, she rejected them. The desperation she had seen in his eyes that morning had been real. The embarrassment, the careful dignity, the genuine gratitude, none of that could have been faked. So what had happened in the 3 weeks since then? How had he gone from sleeping in bus stations to planning multi-million-dollar construction projects? As the meeting began to wind down, and people started asking about how to apply for jobs or express interest in the housing units, William made his way through the crowd, shaking hands and answering individual questions. Keisha watched him work the room with the ease of someone accustomed to dealing with groups of people, but she also noticed how he kept glancing in her direction, as if he was waiting for an opportunity to approach her. Finally, as the crowd began to thin out and people started heading home, William walked directly toward where Keisha was standing. He moved with purpose, but also with what seemed like nervousness, as if he wasn't sure how she would react to seeing him in these dramatically changed circumstances. "Miss Williams," he said when he reached her, extending his hand in the same formal way he had on the bus. "I was hoping you would be here tonight." Keisha shook his hand, noting that his grip was just as firm and confident as it had been before, but now it matched his appearance. "Mr. Hayes," she said, not sure what else to say. "You look different." William laughed, and she could see some of the genuine warmth she had glimpsed on the bus beneath his professional demeanor. "I imagine I do. It's been quite a 3 weeks." "I guess so. What happened? How did you go from—" She gestured vaguely, not sure how to politely reference his previous circumstances. "From sleeping in bus stations to planning housing developments." William finished for her. "That's a story I'd very much like to tell you, Miss Williams. But not here, not with all these people around. Would you be willing to have coffee with me sometime this week? There are some things I'd like to discuss with you." Keisha felt a mixture of curiosity and caution. What kind of things? Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp February air that made everything seem sharper and more focused. Keisha had spent the better part of Friday evening trying to figure out what to wear to coffee with someone who appeared to be far wealthier than anyone she had ever spent time with socially. She eventually settled on her best jeans and a sweater her mother had given her for Christmas, clothes that were nice enough to show respect for the occasion, but not so formal that she would feel uncomfortable. At exactly 9 o'clock, a black car pulled up in front of her apartment building. It wasn't the kind of flashy luxury vehicle she might have expected, but rather a clean, well-maintained sedan that spoke of success without showing off. Through the window, she could see William in the driver's seat, and he waved when he spotted her looking out from the apartment window. Keisha grabbed her purse and coat and headed downstairs, feeling slightly nervous about whatever conversation was about to unfold. The events of the community meeting had been replaying in her mind for days, and she had developed dozens of theories about what might have happened to transform William's circumstances so dramatically. "Good morning, Miss Williams," William said as she approached the car. He got out to open the passenger door for her, a gesture that felt both old-fashioned and oddly touching. He was dressed casually but expensively, in slacks and a sweater that probably cost more than she made in a month. But His manner was the same warm, polite demeanor she remembered from the bus. "Good morning," she replied, settling into the passenger seat and noting that the car's interior was immaculate and comfortable. "Thank you for picking me up." "My pleasure," William said as he pulled away from the curb. "I thought we'd go to a little place I know downtown. They make exceptional coffee, and it's quiet enough for us to talk without being interrupted." As they drove through the city, Keisha found herself studying William's profile and trying to reconcile the successful businessman sitting beside her with the desperate man she had helped on the bus just a few weeks earlier. Every detail about him now spoke of wealth and success, from his perfectly styled hair to his obviously expensive watch. But she could still see glimpses of the vulnerability she had witnessed that Tuesday morning. "Can I ask you something before we get to the coffee shop?" Keisha said as they stopped at a red light. "Of course. That morning on the bus, when I helped you with the fare, were you really in the situation you said you were in? Or was that some kind of test?" William turned to look at her directly, his expression serious. "Miss Williams, I would never test someone's kindness by pretending to be in desperate circumstances. Every word I told you that morning was true. I had lost everything. I was sleeping in shelters, and I genuinely didn't have money for bus fare. What you witnessed was the lowest point in my adult life." "But then how?" Keisha gestured around the car's expensive interior. "That's exactly what I want to explain to you," William said as the light turned green. "It's a complicated story, and it begins with something I didn't tell you about myself that morning." The coffee shop William had chosen was in a part of downtown Detroit that Keisha rarely had reason to visit. It was clearly an upscale establishment, with exposed brick walls, comfortable leather chairs, and the kind of relaxed but sophisticated atmosphere that attracted business professionals and artists. The other customers were well-dressed and spoke in the modulated tones of people accustomed to conducting important conversations in public places. William guided her to a corner table that offered privacy from the rest of the room, and they settled in with large cups of what was admittedly the best coffee Keisha had ever tasted. She waited patiently while William seemed to gather his thoughts, clearly preparing to tell her something significant. "Miss Williams," he began, "when I told you that I had been the CEO of Hayes Construction Company and that I lost everything in a financial scandal, I was telling you the truth. But I didn't tell you the whole truth, partly because I was embarrassed and partly because I wasn't sure you would believe me." Keisha sipped her coffee and waited for him to continue. "What I didn't tell you is that Hayes Construction Company wasn't just any construction business. It was one of the largest affordable housing developers in the Midwest, with projects in 6 states and annual revenues of over $200 million. When I said I lost everything, I meant everything on a scale that most people would find difficult to comprehend." William paused to take a drink of his own coffee, as if he needed the caffeine to fuel what was clearly a difficult confession. "I didn't just lose my house, Miss Williams. I lost 12 houses. I lost a yacht, 3 cars worth more than most people make in a year, a private jet, and investment accounts that contained enough money to fund several small cities. When the scandal broke and the company went bankrupt, the federal government seized assets worth approximately $400 million. Keisha felt her eyes widening despite herself. The numbers William was talking about were so large they felt almost abstract. She had never personally known anyone who possessed that kind of wealth, and the idea that someone could lose such enormous amounts of money was as foreign to her as the idea of having it in the first place. "But here's the part that even the newspapers didn't understand," William continued. "When you have that level of wealth, it's not all sitting in regular bank accounts where you can access it easily. Most of it is tied up in investments, real estate, company stock, trust funds, and other financial instruments that can take months or years to liquidate. When the scandal broke and the government froze my assets, I literally couldn't access any of my own money." "So you really were broke," Keisha said, beginning to understand. "Completely broke," William confirmed. "I had maybe $300 in cash in my wallet the day the news broke, and that was all I could access while the lawyers fought over everything else. My credit cards were canceled when the bank saw the news reports. My personal checking account was frozen as part of the federal investigation. I went from being worth hundreds of millions of dollars on paper to having less money than a minimum wage worker, all in the space of a single day." William's expression grew distant as he recalled those difficult weeks. It's a very strange experience, going from a world where money is never even a consideration to a world where you're counting quarters to see if you can afford a cup of coffee. I had been wealthy for so long that I had forgotten how to live without money. I didn't know how to apply for public assistance. I didn't know where the affordable housing was located. I didn't even know how much a bus fare cost because I hadn't ridden public transportation in decades. Keisha was beginning to see the full scope of William's situation that morning on the bus. So when you couldn't pay the fare, you really were stuck. I was completely unprepared for poverty, William admitted. I had no skills for survival without money, no network of friends who could help me navigate that world, and, honestly, no understanding of how people manage to live on so little. That morning when you helped me, I was on my way to a job interview for a position that paid $12 an hour. For someone who had been making millions of dollars a year, the adjustment was difficult. Did you get the job? William smiled, and, for the first time since they had sat down, she saw genuine warmth in his expression. I did get the job. And, Miss Williams, I want you to know that the 3 days I worked at that warehouse were some of the most important days of my life. Not because of the work itself, though I tried to do it well, but because it taught me things about the world that I had never understood before. What kind of things? I learned what it feels like to be exhausted at the end of every day and still not have enough money to live comfortably. I learned how much courage it takes to ask for help when you're in trouble. I learned that there's a whole economy of people helping each other survive that operates completely outside the world I had always lived in. William's voice grew more animated as he spoke. Do you know what happened on my third day at that warehouse job? One of my coworkers, a woman named Maria who was supporting 3 children on $12 an hour, brought me lunch because she noticed I wasn't eating. She had no idea who I was or what my background was, but she saw that I was struggling and she shared what little she had. That's beautiful, Keisha said, and meant it. It was beautiful, and it was also humbling in a way that changed how I understand the world. I realized that I had spent my entire career building housing for working families without truly understanding the daily reality of the people I was trying to serve. William reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. But 3 days into that warehouse job, my lawyer called with news that changed everything. The FBI had finally arrested my nephew in Mexico, and when they searched his hideout, they found records that proved definitively that I had no knowledge of his embezzlement scheme. He unfolded the paper and handed it to Keisha. It was a newspaper clipping with the headline, "Disgraced CEO, Cleared of All Charges in Construction Company Scandal." The federal government unfroze my assets. The insurance companies that had been withholding settlements finally paid out, and I was able to access trust funds that had been protected from the original seizure. In the space of 24 hours, I went from making $12 an hour to having access to more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. Keisha read through the newspaper article, which detailed how new evidence had completely exonerated William and led to the arrest of his nephew. The article mentioned that William was expected to rebuild his construction company and resume his position as one of the region's most successful developers. "So you really are a billionaire," Keisha said, looking up from the newspaper. "I really am," William confirmed. "Though I've learned some things about money in the past few weeks that I wish I had understood years ago." "What kind of things?" William leaned forward, his expression intense. "I learned that money is a tool, Miss Williams, not a goal. For most of my life, I thought success meant accumulating wealth and the things that wealth could buy. But those 3 weeks of having nothing taught me that the most important things in life, the things that actually matter, can't be purchased." He gestured around the coffee shop. "I can buy the best coffee in the city. I can afford to eat in the finest restaurants. I can live in houses that most people only see in magazines. But none of that gave me what I felt when you stepped forward on that bus to help a stranger. That feeling of knowing that there are good people in the world who will do the right thing even when it costs them something they can't afford to lose." Keisha felt herself blushing slightly. "I just did what anyone should do." "But that's exactly the point," William said earnestly. "You did what everyone should do, but what most people don't do. And that morning, when I was at my lowest point, your kindness reminded me that there are values more important than profit margins and stock prices." William pulled out another piece of paper. this one official-looking with legal letterhead. Which brings me to why I wanted to have this conversation with you, Miss Williams. I want to offer you something, but I want you to understand exactly why I'm offering it and what it means to me. Keisha looked at the document he was sliding across the table, but didn't pick it up. What is it? It's a scholarship, Miss Williams. A full scholarship to any university you choose, including living expenses, books, and spending money for 4 years. But it's not charity, and it's not just because you helped me with bus fare. William's voice grew serious. I'm rebuilding Hayes Construction Company, but I want to build it differently this time. I want to create a company that truly serves working families, that understands the communities we're building for, and that operates with the values I learned during those 3 weeks when I had nothing. I don't understand what that has to do with me. I want you to be part of that company, Miss Williams. Not now, not while you're still learning, but in the future when you've gotten the education you deserve. I want to invest in your education because I believe that someone who would help a stranger without expecting anything in return is exactly the kind of person who should be making decisions about how to house and serve working families. Keisha stared at the scholarship document, unable to quite process what she was hearing. You want to pay for me to go to college? I want to invest in your future because I believe your values and your understanding of what real people need will make you an invaluable asset to any organization working to improve people's lives. The scholarship is unconditional. You can study whatever you want, wherever you want, and you have no obligation to work for my company afterward. William paused, then smiled. But I hope you will. I hope that after you've gotten your education and had time to decide what you want to do with your life, you'll consider joining Hayes Construction Company. Not as an employee, Miss Williams, but as a partner. I want to build a company where the people making decisions understand what it's like to count bus fare and choose between lunch and transportation. Keisha felt overwhelmed by the scope of what William was offering. This is too much, she said quietly. I can't accept something this huge from someone I barely know. You know me better than you think, William replied. You know that when I had nothing, I still tried to maintain my dignity. You know that I'm grateful for kindness and that I don't take generosity for granted. Most importantly, you know that I believe in doing the right thing even when it's difficult. He leaned back in his chair, giving her space to process what he had said. Miss Williams, you gave me $2.50 when you couldn't afford it because you saw someone in need and you chose to help. I'm offering you this scholarship because I can afford it and because I see someone with the potential to make a real difference in the world if she gets the opportunity she deserves. Keisha looked around the coffee shop, noting the comfort tab. The decision came to Keisha 3 days later, not in a moment of careful deliberation, but in an instant of clarity that felt remarkably similar to her choice to help William on the bus. She was walking home from work on a Tuesday evening, the same route she had taken hundreds of times before, when she passed the community center where William had made his announcement about the housing project. Construction crews were already at work in the empty lot next to the center, clearing debris and preparing the ground for the foundation work that would begin the following week. Several men from the neighborhood were among the workers, including Mr. Rodriguez from her building, who had been unemployed for 6 months before landing a job with Hayes Construction Company. She could see the pride in his movements as he operated a piece of heavy machinery, the satisfaction of someone who was finally able to provide for his family again. That's when it hit her. This was what real change looked like. Not abstract promises or distant possibilities, but concrete action that improved people's daily lives. William had taken his restored wealth and his painful education in what it meant to have nothing, and he had used both to create something that mattered. He was building homes for families like hers, providing jobs for men like Mr. Rodriguez, and doing it all in a way that respected the dignity of the people he was serving. Standing there on the sidewalk, watching the construction crews work in the fading light of the winter evening, Keisha realized that she wanted to be part of building things that mattered. She wanted to use whatever talents and opportunities she might develop to create positive change in the world. And if William's scholarship could help her gain the knowledge and credentials to do that work effectively, then she would be foolish to refuse it based on pride or fear. She pulled out her phone and dialed the number on William's business card. Miss Williams. William's voice came through the phone with obvious pleasure. I was hoping you would call. I've made my decision about the scholarship, Keisha said without preamble. I want to accept it, if the offer is still open. The offer is absolutely still open, William replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice. I'm delighted that you've decided to move forward with this opportunity. But I have some conditions, Keisha continued, surprising herself with her own boldness. Of course. What are your conditions? First, I want to work part-time for Hayes Construction while I'm in college. Not because I have to, but because I want to understand the business from the ground up. I want to learn about construction and development and community planning by actually doing the work, not just reading about it in textbooks. That's an excellent idea, William said. We can absolutely arrange that. Second, I want my brother Marcus to be part of this somehow. He's 15, he's smart, and he needs to see that there are legitimate ways to build a good life. Maybe a summer internship program or an after-school job, something that gives him hope and keeps him focused on positive goals. Also easily arranged, William agreed. We're actually planning to develop several youth programs as part of the housing project. Your brother could be one of our first participants. And third, Keisha said, taking a deep breath, I want to study business and urban planning with a focus on affordable housing development. I want to learn everything I can about building communities, not just individual houses. And when I graduate, I want to come back here and help expand what you're doing. William was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. Miss Williams, those are exactly the conditions I was hoping you would propose. You've just described the future I was envisioning for Hayes Construction Company, but you've articulated it better than I could have myself. They arranged to meet the following weekend to discuss the details of the scholarship and her enrollment in college for the fall semester. William recommended several universities with strong business and urban planning programs, and he promised to put her in touch with admissions counselors who could help her navigate the application process. When Keisha hung up the phone, she felt a mixture of excitement and terror that she had never experienced before. She was about to embark on a path that would take her far from everything familiar, into a world of opportunities she had never imagined possible. But she was also making a commitment to return to her community with the knowledge and resources to make it better. The conversation with her family that evening was one of the most emotional of her life. Her mother, Sandra, cried when Keisha explained about the scholarship and what it would mean for their family's future. Marcus listened with wide eyes as she described the internship programs and job opportunities that would be available to him through Hayes Construction. You're really going to college? Marcus asked, his voice filled with a combination of awe and hope. Like, to a real university? I'm really going to college, Keisha confirmed. And when I graduate, I'm coming back here to help build better housing and create more opportunities for families like ours. But that's still 4 years away, which means you need to focus on your own education so you'll be ready for whatever opportunities come your way. Sandra wiped her eyes and looked at her daughter with pride and amazement. I always knew you were special, baby, she said. But I never dreamed you'd get a chance like this. Are you scared? Terrified, Keisha admitted, but also excited. I keep thinking about what Mr. Hayes said about using education to help people. I want to learn everything I can so I can come back and make a real difference. Over the following months, as Keisha prepared for college and watched the housing project take shape in her neighborhood, she began to understand the full scope of what William was building. Hayes Construction wasn't just erecting buildings. They were creating a model for how development could serve communities rather than displace them. The new housing units were designed with input from future residents, ensuring that they met the real needs of working families. The construction jobs included training programs that taught valuable skills to local workers. The community spaces incorporated suggestions from neighborhood residents about what amenities would be most useful. Everything about the project reflected the lessons William had learned during his 3 weeks of poverty about the importance of listening to and respecting the people you're trying to serve. Keisha spent her summer before college working as an intern with Hayes Construction, learning about everything from foundation work to project financing. She was fascinated by the complexity of creating affordable housing that was both economically viable and genuinely useful to the families who would live there. She learned about zoning laws and building codes, about construction materials and architectural design, about community organizing and municipal politics. Most importantly, she learned how to bridge the gap between the world of business and finance that William inhabited and the loose surroundings and well-dressed customers. Then, back at William's earnest face. 3 weeks ago, she had been serving coffee and clearing tables at a diner, worried about her brother's future and resigned to a life of financial struggle. Now she was being offered opportunities she had never even dared to dream about. "What would I study?" she asked, surprising herself by not immediately refusing the offer. "Whatever interests you," William said. "Business, if you want to understand how to build companies that serve communities. Education, if you want to teach and help other young people achieve their potential. Social work, if you want to help families navigate difficult circumstances. The choice is entirely yours. And you really don't expect anything in return?" "I expect you to use the education well," William said seriously. "I expect you to remember where you came from and to use whatever success you achieve to help other people. And I hope, though I don't require, that someday you'll want to work with me to build housing and communities that serve working families with the dignity and respect they deserve." Keisha picked up the scholarship document and read through it carefully. It was exactly what William had described. A full scholarship with no strings attached, enough money to attend any university in the country, and graduate debt-free. The kind of opportunity that could change not just her life, but her family's life, and potentially the lives of people she hadn't even met yet. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Of course," William said. "This is a big decision, and you should take whatever time you need. But, Miss Williams, I hope you'll remember that 3 weeks ago, you made a split-second decision to help someone without thinking about what it might cost you. That decision changed my life in ways you're only beginning to understand. Sometimes the best choices we make are the ones where we choose to trust in possibilities rather than focus on obstacles." As they drove back to Keisha's neighborhood, both of them quiet and lost in their own thoughts, neither of them could have predicted that her decision about the scholarship would be just the beginning of a partnership that would transform not only their own lives, but the lives of thousands of working families who desperately needed affordable housing built by people who understood their struggles and respected their dreams. "The kind of things that might change your life the same way your kindness changed mine," William said seriously. "But I don't want to get into details here. Would Saturday morning work for you? I know a place that makes excellent coffee, and we could talk privately." Keisha looked around the room, which was still buzzing with excitement about the housing project and job opportunities. Whatever had happened to transform William's circumstances, it was clear that his presence in the neighborhood was going to have significant impact on a lot of people's lives. "All right," she said finally. "Saturday morning. But I have to work in the afternoon, so it would have to be early." "Perfect," William said, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a small card. "Here's my new business card, with a phone number that actually works. I'll pick you up at 9, if that's acceptable to you." Keisha took the card, noting that while it looked similar to the one he had given her on the bus, this one was printed on heavier, more expensive paper. "You don't need to pick me up. Just tell me where to meet you." "Miss Williams," William said with a smile that reminded her of their conversation on the bus. "You paid my bus fare when I had nothing. The least I can do is provide transportation for a conversation that I requested." As Keisha walked home through the dark streets, her mind buzzing with questions and possibilities, she had no idea that the conversation William wanted to have would involve an opportunity she had never dreamed possible, and a revelation about his true circumstances that would challenge everything she thought she knew about wealth, poverty, and the invisible connections that tie people's lives together in ways they never expect. D. Elegant, with William's name and title printed in raised letters. William Hayes, Chief Executive Officer, Hayes Construction Company. There was a phone number and email address, though she wondered if they were still valid. "I don't have a working phone anymore," William admitted, as if reading her thoughts. "But that email address still forwards to my personal account. I check it whenever I can find a computer at the library." The bus was slowing down, approaching Keisha's stop. She tucked the business card carefully into her purse and stood up, gathering her coat around her. "It was really nice meeting you, William," she said. "I hope everything works out for you." "Thank you, Miss Williams, for everything." As Keisha stepped off the bus into the cold morning air, she turned to wave goodbye, but William was already looking out the window in the other direction, presumably preparing himself mentally for his job interview. She watched the bus pull away, carrying him toward what she hoped would be a fresh start, and walked toward the restaurant where another day of serving coffee and clearing tables awaited her. She had no way of knowing that the business card now tucked safely in her purse would soon become one of the most important things she had ever owned.